It's a real privilege for me to be here. Every time Betty and Becky call me, I feel privileged that they have given me another chance to come here and to be with all of you and share a few ideas and have a little fun. I think Betty has only been doing this for about 50 years. It's really amazing. And I've been coming to Books Between Bites going back to the days they had it in the Methodist Church before this building was even here. So I feel it's a real privilege for me to be in the rotation that they have established for these meetings. Don't miss next month Rick Cogan. Rick Cogan is good if he just talked about the telephone book, but he is talking about his father, Herman Cogan. I worked for Herman Cogan at the Chicago Daily News many years ago. He was one of the great Chicago journalists, and Rick has thrown into that presentation Ben Hecht. Ben Hecht, the author of Front Page, one of the great all-time comedies ever put on the stage or on film. And that will be, I wonder if I can get here myself. Rick will do a great job with that. Now I'm going to throw you a little unexpected knuckleball here. When Betty and Becky call and they ask you to come here and join Books Between Bites, they ask you for a book or books that you want to talk about. Now, I'm working on a book right now. It's not far from being finished, and maybe someday I'll be talking to you about that. But otherwise, I talk about other people's books, and they're so well organized that they call you way in advance. And so I put on the list 2 books that turned out not to be so hot. I'm going to tell you about one of them. The one about the Houston Astros baseball team, we're just going to completely skip. It was a major disappointment. And the other book, I'll talk about that, and then I'm going to make all of you members without dues, without initiation fee, of Lester's Book Club. And I'm going to go through some books that are really good sports books, interesting, important books that I didn't know about when Betty and Becky called me to ask me what books I'm going to talk about. Lester's Book Club is a very exclusive group. It's modeled on Oprah's book club. You remember when Oprah, she would endorse a book, and it would then sell 10 million copies, and the author's family would be covered for 4 generations. When I endorse a book, nothing happens. So it's similar but dissimilar to the Oprah Book Club. But I'll start with the Rocky Marciano biography that is in the poster. I thought this was going to be really interesting. Marciano was one of the greatest of all heavyweight champions. If you ever want to see an endless debate, you go and find people who are debating whether Marciano or Ali were the greatest of champions. You had Jonathan here a couple of months ago talking about his biography of Muhammad Ali. Now you'll get a little bit about Rocky Marciano, and you can make your own decision. But this is not the first biography of Rocky Marciano. There are at least 2 others. And the guy who wrote it, Mike Stanton, is a friend of mine, terrific guy, great journalist. I had high expectations for his book. But he got off into all sorts of arcane details and stuff that really has nothing to do with anything, and made it a very extra long and much too detailed book, and frequently boring, even though he's talking about one of the great heavyweight champions. Now, in 2019, it's a little bit strange to be talking about these boxers because the fight game has so declined in popularity. We now know what the fighters are doing to each other. We understand concussions. We understand how Parkinson's disease and other ailments can result from the fight game so that it's not the exciting, glamorous thing that it once was. But at the time of when Marciano was fighting, in the 50s and 60s, boxing was one of the top 4 sports in all of the United States. It was college basketball, Major League Baseball, boxing, and horse racing. Those were the big, if you were a sports writer in that era, those are the jobs that you wanted. And many of the greatest of sports writers have written about boxing, and there's an endless series of these books that come out. Jonathan's book on Ali is one of the best ones. You heard about that. And now we have Mike Stanton writing about Marciano. Marciano grew up in Brockton, Massachusetts. Brockton, Massachusetts at the time was a factory town, and there were incredibly 5 shoe factories in the same town. The high school teams were called the Shoe Men. 2 words, the Shoe Men. Where else are you going to see this? His father worked there. What Rocky Marciano knew was he wanted nothing to do with this. He was going to work his way out of that situation. Even with these ambitions, he dropped out of high school and he thought he could become a catcher in Major League Baseball. And if you can visualize Marciano, many of you here are old enough to have some memory of Marciano. He was not tall. He was built in a very square way, huge legs, huge arms. He easily could have been a great catcher, but he was so slow on his feet that he couldn't play in Major League Baseball. So he had to find something else. And in the Army, he discovered boxing. The book goes through all of this in great detail, including his Italian ancestry going back into Italy. Marciano began to understand the fight game in the Army. He also was a conditioning freak. He was a workout freak before it was fashionable. He probably was the best conditioned heavyweight fighter of all time. He had many amateur fights. He was very impressive in those fights, and then he decided to turn pro to the amazement of his parents and a lot of people that he had grown up with, and he had enormous success. He never lost a professional fight. He's the only undefeated heavyweight in the history of boxing. He won 49 consecutive fights. The turning point came in September of 1952. He has worked his way up. He's fighting the then heavyweight champion, Jersey Joe Walcott, an excellent fighter, a master of the art and the science of boxing, a guy who understood all the different maneuvers that boxers have to learn how to do. And for 13 rounds, Walcott was embarrassing Marciano. Walcott was outsmarting him. He was quick to the punch. He was ahead of him in every way. One of the greatest of all sports writers was a guy named William Knack. He was a colleague of mine on Sports Illustrated. We became good friends. He died about a year ago, and he wrote of Marciano in the ring with Walcott. Marciano had chased, but not quite found, had thrown, but not quite landed, and had struck, but not quite hard enough. Then in the 13th round, Marciano knew that either he knocks him out or he's going to lose this fight, and chances are, given the way things were back then, his career as a fighter would be over, and he would not have achieved the riches and the success that he sought. He worked Walcott into the ropes of the ring. Walcott had nowhere to go. Walcott faked one way, went the other way, and Marciano's right hand was waiting for him. He landed a blow on his face. One of the writers at the time, Red Smith, said it was a right hand that registered 9 on the Richter scale. He hit Walcott as hard as anybody has probably ever been hit. And down goes Walcott, and now Marciano is the champion. Incredibly, he defended his title only 6 times over the next 3.5 years, and then he retired. Stanton in this book does a good job of trying to figure out why Marciano retired when he could have made considerably more money with even 3 more fights. And Marciano, among his prime characteristics, is he was a tightwad. He was probably the stingiest guy who would never pay for anything. And you could go to lunch with him 10 days in a row and he would never reach for the check. And he had made a deal with his manager, a guy named Al Weil, that the manager would get 50% of all that Marciano earned. The manager was the one who set up the fights, who did all the work of all the administration of his life. And he just decided he wasn't going to give Al Weil 50% of anything anymore, so he retires. This is how stingy he was. He could have made much more money and split it with Weil. Weil, at this time, the crime syndicate had total control of the boxing game. There was a guy named Frankie Carbo, a hoodlum from New York, who was in charge of boxing. Al Weil worked with him, and that's how Marciano got these fights. And once he was retired from the ring, Marciano became America's guest. He went everywhere, and he went there for free. He would never pay. He would go and make an appearance someplace for cash money. He wanted cash. He would not take checks, because then he'd have to give half to Al Weil. So he'd be walking around with a lunch bag full of $100 bills. He'd come to his wife, he'd come to his mother, and he'd hand them a bag, and it'd be full of money. He stashed money. He flew around the country for these various appearances. Back then, the heavyweight champion was a celebrity, was somebody people wanted to see. Now, who here can name the heavyweight champion today? I can't. I'm in the business. I mean, but back then, if Marciano came someplace, he could draw a crowd, and people would pay him to come. Just to give you what he would show up for, also anything, where they would invite him and pay him $250 or more, he would show up. He made an appearance in the London nightclub, and Stanton dug this up for the book. He's at the nightclub in London. Marciano is there. He draws a crowd. He gets up and he says, "I don't know what I'm doing here. I cannot sing. I cannot dance. Just to be sociable, I'll fight the best man in the house." But he goes around making a living doing this. He would not pay for commercial air. He would take private planes. He'd find a free ride someplace. And this developed as a pattern of his life. Private planes, a lot of womanizing, a tightwad, and he would go from appearance to appearance. He was always near mobsters. He never was a part of the crime syndicate. He didn't do things for these guys, but he was always involved with hoodlums. Raymond Petrarca, who was the godfather of the New England area, Carlo Gambino, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese. Most of these guys ended up in the penitentiary, and one of Rocky's things is he would go to the penitentiary and show fight films to these guys while they were imprisoned. The wardens went along with this. Why? They wanted to meet Rocky, and they wanted to see the movies. And he would, as I mentioned, he would always carry around all this cash money. He was a very bad investor. He actually bought swampland in Florida and found out the hard way. I mean, this is like, he actually did it. He bought a coal mine that had no coal. And then finally, he invested a bunch of money in what was going to be the solid cure for arthritis. I can tell you from personal experience that didn't work. I still have my arthritis. He had a loan business. He had all this money, and so he would loan it out at exorbitant rates and get it paid back. At one point, he had $750,000 out on the street in loans. He also loaned $100,000 to a thug, a hoodlum in Cleveland by the name of Pete DeGravio. He would be like the Tony Accardo or the Sam Giancana of Cleveland. And at this point, the IRS finally began to catch on to what Rocky was doing. So they summoned him to come to Cleveland to talk to the agents about this thug and about his loan business. And he didn't want to go. He knew he had to go. He shows up in Cleveland. He goes into the Internal Revenue Service office, and he is told, incredibly, that DeGravio, his mobster partner, had been shot and killed the night before, and the investigation was over. Very fortunate. Then his manager, after that, when the IRS would come along and they'd want to talk to Rocky, he would say, okay, that's fine. He lives in Brockton, Massachusetts. You come to the IRS office in Brockton, Massachusetts. Everybody there was a Marciano fan. They weren't going to touch him. So he skated through his life without trouble from the tax people, even though he was clearly in violation. He had people who would collect on the loans. The guy that I mentioned earlier, Bill Knack, and I wrote an article in Sports Illustrated about Marciano several years ago. And my job was to find out about how he collected, one of my jobs was to find out about how he collected his loans. And he had a guy here in Chicago named Frankie One Ear Fratto. He was called One Ear because he couldn't hear very well. The mobsters had these names. And so I find Frankie Fratto, and I go to talk to him about Rocky Marciano. And by this time, Fratto was in semi-retirement, but he is this huge Sicilian. And I asked him, how did you manage to collect money for Rocky Marciano? And he said, I said the same thing to everybody. It always worked. You owe my friend some money. I suggest you pay it back. And they would pay. Now imagine what else was going on here. This is like the offer you cannot refuse. Remember that in the movie, The Offer You Cannot Refuse? Don Corleone has Luca Brasi with him, and he holds the gun to the guy's head. You can either give Johnny Fontaine his freedom from your onerous contract, or I'm going to blow your brains out. It was as simple as that. So Frankie, he had these huge hands. He was a terrifying guy when he was 75 years old, and I was talking to him. But he collected for Rocky. Finally, it all came together. He decided at the last minute to go help somebody open an insurance brokerage in Des Moines, Iowa. And he finds a ride in a private plane from Midway Airport to Des Moines. The guy driving the plane had 30 hours of experience. He had no idea what he was doing. They flew straight into a storm. They crashed, and that was the end of Rocky Marciano. He was dead at age 45, incredibly. And all of his habits and procedures came together in a kind of a perfect storm, and that was the end of him. The book is called Unbeaten, Rocky Marciano's Fight for Perfection in a Crooked World. The most interesting was, even with his Italian background, he was able to hold off the thugs and the mobsters, even though they controlled boxing, and he and his manager had to work with them. So he never really got involved in their work other than the loans, and probably one of the great fighters of all time. The fans of Ali will tell you that he was the greatest. Marciano's fans, who tend to be Italian, will tell you that he was the greatest. It's one of the great debates in all of sports. All right, now, Lester's Book Club. To be a book, in my book club, the author must first have read a book before they write a book. I have high standards. For example, Pete Rose, who has written his memoir 4 times, will never be in my book club because he doesn't read any books. So the books that I'm going to talk about, you have the list. I'll give you a little bit on each one of these. These are, generally speaking, important books that are well worth reading, or if you have somebody in your family or your friends who has a birthday or something coming up, they can make wonderful gifts for somebody who is a fan either of these sports or of this kind of journalistic writing. The first one is a new biography of Babe Ruth. It's by Jane Levy, and I highly recommend this. This is a book that combines a look at the greatest baseball player of all time with a very interesting and insightful examination of the phenomenon of celebrity in the United States. Ruth was probably the first genuine national celebrity in the history of our culture. And Jane Levy points this out. We all know he was one of the greatest pitchers of all time, and clearly he was one of the great home run hitters of all time. He was the all-around baseball player. People forget he also had a great throwing arm. He played right field. And what happened beginning with the 1927 Yankees and Babe Ruth is that he became a celebrity unlike any celebrity in the history of the country. Many people have written books about Babe Ruth. I think in the world of sports literature, the only person who has more books written about them is Muhammad Ali, including Jonathan, whom you heard a couple of months ago. But there's a shelf of Babe Ruth books. I must have 20 in my library at home, and I'm just scratching the surface. This is one of the best. He was on a barnstorming tour in 1927. The baseball season was over. He and Lou Gehrig and some of the other stars went around playing games just to draw an audience. They would come, for example, if they were doing it today, to Elfstrom Stadium right here, and they would put on an exhibition, fill up the place, and make a little money from the tickets and have a lot of fun showing off what they can do. If you look at the concept of celebrity, which is increasingly important in our culture, you can see it now manifested in the Kardashians, who are famous, as near as I can tell, for being famous. They've never done anything. Or you can also take a look at President Trump. He was a celebrity. He was not a politician. He was on television. Reality TV, I never saw the show, but obviously more than half of the United States did see the show. And so we now have a celebrity culture that even envelops the White House. And this was the beginning of that culture. He had an agent, the first agent in the history of sports, by the name of Christy Walsh. Jane Levy does a great job describing his work. And he turned a guy who was, particularly after his baseball career was over, he was a bit of a boozer, he was a womanizer, he was basically a kind of a midnight rambler, and Christy Walsh turned him into this guy that everybody loved, kind of the lovable lout of America, and if he would walk down the street, everything would come to a stop. It is interesting to see how celebrity works. Rocky Marciano used it to basically pay for his entire life. As some of you know, my parents were in Homestad in their final years. Also in Homestad at that time were Tom Skilling's parents. Tom Skilling, the weatherman on Channel 9, is the most recognizable television personality in this market. There's no exception. He is the highest paid person on TV in Chicago by multiples. He sets the market for other TV meteorology performers. He sets his pay with WGN, and then all the other markets, New York, Los Angeles, fit in below Tom Skilling. So if you want to know, and if you want to know how celebrity works, I was at Homestead. I was taking my mother to the supermarket, and then we were going to have lunch. This was a regular procedure. And Tom shows up. His mother is there. And I said, well, why don't we can all have lunch? This is a brilliant idea. We can all have lunch. We'll go, I forget the name of the restaurant. It's a coffee shop restaurant in St. Charles. And why don't we just meet there in an hour? And Tom says, you know, that's maybe not such a good idea. And everybody says, no, Tom, come on, it'll be wonderful. We can all visit and have a great time. And Lester's buying. Yeah, here's the highest paid guy on TV. I'm buying lunch. So we go to the restaurant. We sit at a table for 4. Tom never got to eat. There was a line of people coming up to say hello. They wanted to take their picture with him. They wanted to shake hands, and they wanted to ask him stuff about the people that worked for him. These are his fans. I never saw anything like it. He never got to eat. Now, if you look at him, he's sneaking in some food somewhere. But on that particular lunch, he never got to eat. And then I later found out if he took his mother out to lunch, they did the drive-through. You know, that was the only way that he could have any peace and enjoy a lunch with his mom when she was at Homestead. And then, no bill. Oh, Tom Skilling was here. We're going to take care of this table. A couple of Greeks. They hadn't done that in months for anybody. So we had a delightful lunch with the exception of Tom. He had to sit there and take care of his fans. Levy in the book, it's called The Big Fella, Babe Ruth and the World He Created. The world he created is the world of celebrity culture. And she goes through his terrible childhood. She uses the barnstorming tour and then flashes back and flashes forward in her writing technique to cover his entire life. He had a terrible childhood. His father took off. His mother was a drunk. And he ended up at age 7 in a place called St. Mary's Industrial School for Orphaned, Delinquent, Incorrigible, and Wayward Boys. Can you imagine what that... Talk about socially unacceptable today. Orphaned, delinquent, incorrigible, and wayward boys. But running the school was Brother Matthias, a priest who understood the game of baseball, 6'4", and he got Babe Ruth playing baseball as a kind of therapy for the terrible childhood that he was going through. If you follow sports, you know there are great heroic achievements that we enjoy watching, and then there are these fantastic blunders that we also enjoy watching. It's just part of being a fan of sports. And the Boston Red Sox had Babe Ruth, and they let him go to the Yankees in what is easily the biggest blunder in the whole array of blunders in the history of sports. And Jane Levy explains in detail the finances of that transaction, and when you finish reading what she has written, you realize that not only did the Red Sox give up the greatest player that ever played, they actually paid the Yankees to take him off their hands. So it's even worse than you thought, and she dug up all the details of the transaction. So this is a good book for a baseball fan, or even and also for somebody who's interested in the culture and the sociology of the United States, because this is the beginning of celebrity culture. She really does a great job. Next is The Breakaway. This is the story of the Wirtz family and the Chicago Blackhawks. As some of you know, the Wirtz family has owned the Chicago Blackhawks for now the third generation. The first generation helped to establish the game of professional hockey. They owned the Chicago Stadium. They owned 2 of the 6 teams, the Detroit Red Wings and the Chicago Blackhawks, back at one time. Amazing thing that could never happen today. And then along comes Bill Wirtz, second generation. One of the worst owners in the history of sports. When I was at ESPN, every other year we would rank the professional sports teams. There's 120 teams in football, baseball, basketball, and hockey. And we would rank them. Who is the best franchise of them all? A couple times it was the New England Patriots football team. Who are the worst? For 6 consecutive years, the Chicago Blackhawks under Bill Wirtz were in the bottom 2, 119 or 120. And he did everything he could to destroy the team. It is unknown why he was doing these things. He would never explain anything to anybody. He hated us in the sports media. We were the enemy. Fake news is mild compared to what Bill Wirtz would do. I was in a restaurant in New York when I was in Sports Illustrated. Somehow, and I had written a lengthy article in Sports Illustrated about how the owners of the hockey teams were stealing from the player pensions, which they were, and they got caught and they had to pay it back. And I have no idea how he recognized me, but I walk in this restaurant with 3 colleagues, and he jumps up and comes over and just starts screaming, red in the face, screaming at me. Finally, the maitre d' and some waiters had to take him back to his, and he's a preferred customer there. We were a couple, 4 hack writers. But just for no reason at all, he's yelling at me over that article. A very difficult guy. He dies. That's where this begins. He has 2 sons, and one is a huge guy who loves hockey. The other one is a skinny guy who's a vegetarian and probably couldn't recognize a hockey player from a lacrosse player. And we all thought, and Bill Wirtz thought, that the hockey team would go to the skinny vegetarian. But his brother took over. His name is Rocky Wirtz. And it seems like his approach was, if my father did it this way, I'll do it that way. And that's what he did. It's amazing. And he and his father were close. But he reversed all of the mistakes that his father had made. One of the best things, and this is described beautifully in the book, one of the best things he did was to hire John McDonough, the CEO of the Chicago Cubs, to come over and run the Blackhawks. And McDonough, he doesn't have it in the book, but I've heard McDonough tell this story. McDonough gets a call from Rocky Wirtz. At first he thinks it's a prank. Wirtz had to call back because he hung up on him. So then he realized, okay, this is Rocky Wirtz. I'll be happy to talk to him. And he tells Rocky, Rocky, I'm happy here with the Cubs. This is one of the top franchises in all of sports. We're right on the edge of great things. I'm not interested in talking about going anywhere. So then McDonough thinks to himself, here I am in Chicago, and I'm turning down lunch with a guy named Rocky. This may not be a good thing to do. So he calls him back. Okay, Rocky, we'll have lunch. And they find a place in Schaumburg where nobody would see them together because people would recognize them and know, oh, what's going on here? And they have lunch for 3 hours, and McDonough agrees to take over the team. And he does the same thing. He reverses everything Bill Wirtz did. And since then, they have won 3 Stanley Cups They have a very interesting team. Even now, it's a difficult year this year. They hired Quenneville as the coach. Now he's been fired, but they did all these things right. On his second day on the job, this is in the book, McDonough made peace with Bobby Hull, maybe the greatest of all Blackhawks players, brought him back into the organization. And if that's all you knew about it, you would think, what a brilliant move. Well, Bobby Hull is one of the most difficult people in the world. And they were taking big chances bringing him back in. But McDonough has managed to make him into an asset for the team. He's a missionary for the team, and he goes around helping to sell tickets and to entertain fans of the Blackhawks. But this book, it's total Chicago book. It has no national implications, but it's a fascinating story of a Chicago family and of a successful sports franchise. The Chicago Blackhawks now in the ESPN rankings are number 4, from second to last to number 4, under Rocky and John McDonough. Okay, next, big game. The National Football League in Dangerous Times. This is by a guy named Mark Leibovich, who is one of the great American sports writers. He writes for the New York Times, Sunday Magazine. He has written other books that were very good, and he decides to write his NFL book. It basically is a critique of the owners. There are 32 teams. Most of the owners are real estate developers or car dealers. Some are not. And Leibovich, who is Jewish, goes through whether they're Jewish or Gentile and has a lot of fun with the things they do based on that in the book. All sorts of interesting, very gossipy but fascinating kind of things about the owners. Early in the book, he describes them as aging show poodles. I love it. Aging show poodles. It's a terrific book. There have been a few good books about the National Football League. The most famous one is a novel called Semi-Tough by a guy named Dan Jenkins, one of the great all-time sports writers. There's another novel called North Dallas 40 by Pete Gent, a former player turned writer, which is also, and this one is right up there with those books. It's a very good book. But it's for football fans. This is not a critique of America. This is a critique of the National Football League and the owners, and you really need to be a fan of the league. If you have somebody who plays fantasy football or watches on football games on Sunday, this is the book. It's got all sorts of interesting things. He points out all of the blunders that the owners have made, and even though they've made all these blunders, it's the most successful enterprise ever in the history of sports anywhere in the world. And he quotes that the guy didn't own the Dallas Cowboys, but he operated the team for a long time. There was a guy named Tex Schramm, and he once said, all players are like cattle, owners are like ranchers, you can always get more cattle. And that basically is the attitude of the owners toward the players. Now, you know, a big-time quarterback or some great star, the owners are very nice, but the journeyman players are treated with a certain amount of scorn and contempt, and the owners have done that for generations. He describes how the owners have allowed the relocation of teams at the expense of fans. The Rams started in Los Angeles, came to St. Louis, developed a terrific following in St. Louis, and then turned around and went back, to the dismay of St. Louis fans. The owner of the Rams, Stan Kroenke, cannot come back to St. Louis. He'd have to have security. I mean, if there was ever a 21st century lynching, it would be Kroenke in St. Louis. He has several good paragraphs in here about Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, who, if he were examined by a psychiatrist, could be certified as a true megalomaniac, and he makes a wonderful case on him. And then, amazingly, this book has been out for almost a year. He was prescient on Bob Kraft, Bob Kraft, the owner of the Patriots, who was recently arrested for patronizing a massage parlor. And in the book, he describes Kraft as one of the smartest of owners, as a guy who cared about his fans, as a guy who, unlike all the other owners, had some concern for the community and for his players. And he also noted that when Kraft's wife died, he seemed to become, as he said, unmoored. His life just spread out in all sorts of directions, and Leibovich almost anticipated what happened. As much of a surprise that was to the rest of the world, Leibovich pretty well saw that coming in this book. He's got another nice section about another rare thing, a good owner, Woody Johnson. He is of the family Johnson & Johnson, and he is now the ambassador to Great Britain, and is actually doing a very good job while owning the New York Jets. He's also got in the book Donald Trump's attempts to become an owner in the National Football League. Several years ago, there was a chance to buy the New York Jets, and he thought he would be the right guy to own the New York Jets. He would be in this club of 32 owners, and the owners rejected him. It was basically, are you allowed to say this, a black ball or a white ball, whatever it was. They said, oh no, we don't want this guy. And that lingered with him. And then, remember when the football player kneels during the national anthem? Right. Trump was ready, poised to get even with the NFL, and came ripping into him. The owners, you should get rid of this guy, you should make the players conform. He made it into a political issue to his advantage, and also got even with the NFL owners. And because of some of his criticism, the number of viewers went down, the number of people going to the games went down. It was a bad year for the NFL, and Trump contributed to it in his own way. He has wonderful material about Roger Goodell, who is the commissioner of the league. His salary is $40 million a year. He makes more doing what he's doing than LeBron James makes playing basketball. And Leibovich describes Goodell as a bull who carries his own china shop. He cannot help but screw things up. He has a gift. And he says, he is the most prodigious slapper of backs, knower of names, gladder of hands, and toucher of bases in the history of the world. So the ultimate glad hander, $40 million job. Good for Roger. Good for Roger. And then, having talked about the Jewish owners and the Gentile owners and all these interesting things, he goes to Green Bay, Wisconsin to find out what's going on with the Green Bay Packers. And he's going to go to a game, and it's really cold. Terrible cold, 8 degrees. And he says to somebody, how am I supposed to go to this game? What am I supposed to wear? And the guy says to him, well, that's easy. That's easy, Mark. What you do is you dress exactly like you would dress to go ice fishing. And Leibovich looks at him and he says, as a rule, Jews do not ice fish. So that was no help to him. Okay, now, next, this is a surprisingly good book, The Game. Harvard, Yale, and America in 1968. We all know 1968 was a pivotal year, all sorts of things going on. Assassination of Bobby Kennedy, of Martin Luther King, the 68 convention here in Chicago, all of the turmoil of 68. And at that very same year, Harvard plays Yale in what, for some reason, in the eastern part of the United States is referred to as the game. It's one of these football games where people wear ties and tweed jackets to go to the game. And in this particular game, Yale is ahead 22-0. They're going to win. Somehow Harvard comes back and manages to score a tie in the final, actually beyond, the time had expired, and they made a 2-point conversion to tie the game. And the Harvard Crimson, the student newspaper, had a headline, "Harvard beats Yale 28-28." one of the greatest, I was on a campus newspaper, I'm envious of that headline, one of the greatest of all time. But this writer, George Howe Colt, uses that game and Harvard and Yale to show what was going on in the United States in 1968. It's very much like Jane Levy did with the Babe Ruth book, and it's fascinating to see all the insights and how he uses the game to take us through all of the turmoil of 1968. It's a really interesting portrait of that era. In the game, playing in the game for Harvard was Tommy Lee Jones, the actor. Playing for was Calvin Hill, who became an all-pro running back, whose son became a great professional, or reasonably great professional basketball player. And the quarterback for Yale was Brian Dowling, BD. If you read Doonesbury, he is the key to a lot of what happens in Doonesbury. Gary Trudeau was at Yale at the same time, and he started the comic strip on the Yale Daily News with BD and Michael Doonesbury as the stars of the comic strip. So BD is the star of what is probably the second greatest comic strip in the history of comic strips. Some would say it's the first. My vote is for Calvin and Hobbes, then Doonesbury. As you can tell, the first thing I do in the morning is read the comics, so I don't want to disappoint you. Both schools at that time, all men, extremely preppy. The Harvard had 61 students from Exeter. Yale had 43 from Andover. So, and then in the next few years, the Ivy League schools began to take in more public school people. So all of that is described in here, as well as the turmoil of 1968. Now the next on the list is written by a guy who's on sports radio named Clay Travis. He's one of these shock jock radio guys, and right here, you can't see it, but his claim to fame now is he has been banned from both CNN and ESPN. He's the first American who's been able to do that in the whole history of the world. So, and he has all these ideas. Republicans buy sneakers to how the left is ruining sports with politics. And he particularly rips into ESPN as being too far left for his taste. And he does make a very interesting case. There are many criticisms of ESPN. It's the biggest, sports media company there is. It was a great place for me to work for a number of years. I enjoyed every minute there, but there were some problems, although I'm not so sure left-wing politics was the biggest of the problems, but he does make a very interesting case. This is very funny. It can be sophomoric and somewhat juvenile. So if you have a grandson or a nephew or a son who's 18 years old and tends to listen to sports radio, this would be a book for them. It's very funny in numerous places. He particularly rips into one of our bosses at ESPN, a guy by the name of John Skipper. And Skipper was the CEO of all television, both journalistic television and the games themselves. And he was involved in reorganizing the company, firing 300 people, a huge reorganization. And after that was completed, 2 weeks later, Skipper leaves the company and says, "I am going into rehab for cocaine addiction." So he was our leader as he was hitting rock bottom in his addiction. And have they reversed the things that he did? Some of them, not many, but some. And so he has you know, he picks on Skipper, but he's got a few things he can say about John Skipper. The other boss that we had, and it's not in this book, was a guy named Millman, Chad Millman, grew up in Highland Park, Illinois. He was the number 2 under Skipper as they were doing this total reorganization. And about a month after that reorganization, he left to become an expert in sports gambling, kind of the lowest of the low in the world of sports. So those were our leaders when we had all of this reorganization. Then we have the biography of Jim Brown by Dave Zirin. Jim Brown, Last Man Standing. Jim Brown was one of the greatest football players of all time, and he was the single greatest lacrosse player of all time. He went to Syracuse University, and you could play 2 sports back then, and he was a fantastic running back in football, a superb athlete, and then he went and learned how to play lacrosse, and there's never been a lacrosse player like him ever since. If you go to the Dome, where the Syracuse lacrosse team, which is a national powerhouse even now, if you go there, they have a portrait of Jim Brown playing lacrosse that's about 4 stories high. It's a very impressive thing. Superb athlete. And the Dave Zirin is the opposite end of the guy Republicans buy sneakers to. He is way to the left. He writes sports columns for The Nation magazine, and he has made a niche for himself, taking a kind of a left-wing radical's look at sports. I'm sure if Dave was here, he would be all Medicare for all, free college. He'd be all the stuff Bernie Sanders. He'd be a perfect clone of the Bernie Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez approach to life. Very interesting young man. His father and I were in college together and worked on the college newspaper, a very small world here. His father was still is exactly the same. And he points out that Brown was a guy who not only was a great athlete, he was a complete political and social activist. If Michael Jordan, for example, Tiger Woods, for another example, they're not going to get into politics or social issues. Tiger Woods likes to say he was going to bring golf to young African Americans. Never happened. I mean, he talks about it. His father talked about it. Never happened. And Tiger Woods is busy selling golf equipment, and Michael Jordan is busy selling Nike. So Jim Brown was the opposite. He got involved in everything, particularly racial issues. And he also was a very successful actor. He was in 15 major movies in Hollywood. He always played respectable characters. If you compare him to O.J. Simpson, who also did movies, O.J. Simpson was always playing comic characters that seemed to demean the African American race. Jim Brown, on the other hand, was the black Superman and insisted on having that kind of role in his. He, however, has a history of beating up on the women in his life. He's been locked up twice for that. Zirin tries to explain that in the book. Obviously, it's a part of his legacy, and it has really put a shadow over what were otherwise very interesting achievements in politics and on social issues. President Obama, who loved to have athletes coming in the White House, he had 50 different sports teams come to the White House during his 8 years. That's a record that will never be broken. And yet, Obama kept Jim Brown at a distance. He wasn't going to have him in there. Donald Trump, on the other hand, invited Jim Brown to the inauguration, and he was standing, if you look carefully, he was in the front row as Trump was inaugurated 3 years ago. So it's a great biography of Jim Brown. Nobody else has tried to do that. This is the first one. it might be the last one, but it's also a look at racial politics over all these years, going back to about 1962, when Brown became an activist. Well written, very well researched, interesting book. Now, just a couple things on these last two, and we'll have some time for some questions. Pomerantz, it's on the list that we gave you. Pomerantz, The Last Pass. This is for people from New England, people who are interested in racial politics. This is the story of Bill Russell and Bob Cousy on the Boston Celtics. In the world of sports, the Boston market is viewed as the most racist of all markets. Black players tend to try to stay away from Boston because of a whole history. And a lot of that history is what happened to Bill Russell when he was playing on championship teams in Boston. Bob Cousy, graduate of Holy Cross and one of the great basketball players of all time. These guys won, I think, 11 championships in 13 years. And this is the story of their friendship and how it ebbed and flowed and had racial difficulties along the way. It's a very moving, occasionally tear-jerking story of two men trying to figure out how to relate to each other. Here are two guys who were at the pinnacle of sports, and they had difficulties getting along and then became very fast friends at the end. It has a happy ending. The last book I have not yet read, but it is said to be the best book about soccer ever written. Now, the reason I haven't read it yet is soccer is low on my list. I am of that generation of sports writers. Okay, we know there's soccer out there, but just don't bother me with it for a while. For the last 30 years, I've been listening to people say, all these kids play soccer. It's going to be a major sport. I'm waiting. Why do all these kids play soccer? Because then they don't have to watch it. That's why. There were a number of reviews of the club, and it is said to be the greatest soccer book ever written. So if you have people in your life who are interested in soccer, this is the book to buy for them as a gift. I wish I could give you more detail, but I have yet to. I may read it. If Betty and Becky invite me back next year, I might tell you about it. But don't count on it. Don't count on it. Okay, we've got some time for some questions. Catherine.
Well, in this room, I don't know that Cub fans would love this book. An earlier Jane Levy book is Koufax.
Yeah.
And I grew up a Brooklyn fan. I just devoured it.
Yeah. It's an interesting point that Catherine makes. Jane Levy has written two previous books, one about Sandy Koufax, the great left-handed pitcher, Jewish ball player, and another about Mickey Mantle, another great player in the history of baseball. Both excellent books. The Koufax book in particular was a big surprise because Koufax over the years became a bit of a recluse. He was not talking to anybody in any public way. He was like J.D. Salinger, the great fiction writer. He just went off and kind of hid out and stayed away from public view. But Jane Levy persuaded him that he should go public with his story, and she did a great job on that book. And Koufax, of course, was one of the more fascinating pitchers in the history of baseball. Did phenomenal things with the ball as a pitcher, and one of the greats, maybe the greatest left-hander of all time, unless you take a good look at Babe Ruth in his Boston Red Sox years, when he was able to pitch 9 innings and get everybody out. Okay, what else? Yes, Beth.
Since you're on the topic of baseball, talk about the pitch clock.
Oh.
I'm just interested in your position on that.
Yeah, the question is, what about the proposed pitch clock in baseball? Major League Baseball which is thriving, which has increased revenues each year, both in terms of tickets sold, advertising sold, and TV money. And they somehow think that they have to improve the game. And what do they mean by improve the game? Make it faster. Now, I'm a baseball fan, I'm a Cub fan. You don't have to speed the game up for me. I can tell you that. I like being there. I like sitting in Wrigley Field, and if there's 2.5 minutes between innings, that's fine with me. Where I'm in no hurry. Once I get to the ballpark, I'll be happy to stay there. There's all sorts of interesting things to watch in the game, things to think about, things to figure out. That's what makes it a great game. But the Lords of Baseball want to speed it up, and one of the things they're considering, and it might, are they going to do it next year? They're still negotiating with the union.
It's in spring training right now, I think.
Yeah, I think it's out for the time. But they wanted the pitcher to have to deliver the next pitch within a certain number of seconds, instead of standing out there trying to figure out what his next pitch is going to be, or whatever they're doing while they're standing out there. The Cubs had a pitcher named Rick Sutcliffe, had one phenomenal year, and he worked very slowly. There would be these long pauses between pitches. And I heard him say one time, the reason I was going so slowly is I was hoping the pain in my arm would go away before the next pitch. Because what you do as a pitcher is such an incredible thing, and the damage you do, they're always in pain. They need to have time to get ready for the next pitch. And to me, it's a very bad idea, but there's great pressure to speed up the game. Instead of a game being 3.5 hours, they want it to be 3 hours. And they're thinking of all sorts of things like that to try to speed it up. I would leave it alone, but they're not asking me about this, that's for sure.
They're not asking a fan either.
Yes?
You mentioned that the Blackhawks were the 4th best team out there. Who are the top 3?
Now, I hope I can... The Patriots are up, I think, at the top. The Cowboys are up there somewhere, maybe not in the top 3.
Where did the Cubs fit?
The Cubs were number 5 or 6. They're usually the second best baseball franchise after the Yankees. But I can't remember exactly the order. You can look it up on the web. We do it every other year, so I think they would be doing it again this year. I'm gone from there now, so I don't.
I just had in the NFL in Dangerous Times. What did they say about McCaskey's?
Oh,
if you could have a few words
actually,
on that.
The question is, in the NFL book, Mark Leibovich, what does he say about the McCaskeys? Almost nothing about the McCaskeys. He mentions Virginia as being the matriarch of the team, and in a way, it's a success that he didn't say anything about the McCaskeys, because he said bad things about everybody. So that means the McCaskeys are doing probably a little better than we think. But there, she is 94, 90, a mere 94, 95. Betty's got it all over her. And when she leaves us, I think most of us who have kept track of this see 3 groups among her children. And they will be fighting. And there's at least one group that wants to then cash out and get their money and sell the team to somebody else. Other 2 groups we don't know. But there will be a real battle, and there will be some inheritance tax problems, because the team is going to be worth more than $3 billion when Virginia passes on. But right now, she's in charge. She comes to the games. She goes to games in New York. It's a remarkable woman. And so she is still the boss. She's the daughter of George Halas, the founder of the team, for those of you who may not know. Yes?
Could you comment on the pay structure that we seem to be getting in baseball now?
Oh my.
Wow. Would I comment on the pay structure that is in baseball now? I've been doing this work for 30 years, and every year we think baseball salaries have reached a peak and they cannot go higher. And then they do. And then they do. We just saw these last two contracts, Harper and Trout, that have gone completely into the stratosphere. That's guaranteed money. If they get hurt and they can't play, they get the money. It changes a family for generations. It's the reason baseball has no salary cap. The union is strong. It has had brilliant leadership, and for a period of time, genius level leadership. So, and the players, unlike other athletes, stick together. They have great solidarity. They know what their leverage is. They're fearless in using it. They understand that unless they demand something, they're not going to get it, and in contrast to football players. And so the players' union is the cause of all of these increases. And the good thing for the owners is that they just keep making more money, so they can afford to pay Mike Trout what he's going to get paid for, what is it, 14 years? So,
$430 for 12.
430 for 12, yeah, imagine that, $430 million. I mean, you could endow a college. You know, it's incredible. It's incredible. But the teams just keep making money, and you think there's going to be a ceiling, and there isn't. In the other sports, there are salary caps, and so they can only go so high. But think of the NBA players; they're all making $20 million a year. You know, the guy who comes in as a substitute, making $20 million a year. So they'll keep going up, particularly in baseball. It's not going to stop. Catherine.
Lester, I hope you can disabuse me of this. I heard it on Sports Talk Radio that the major league owners got put into the budget a couple of years ago, the federal budget, that spring training was not work, and that the minor league players get no pay during spring training. They get breakfast and lunch and $25 for dinner.
The question is, minor league players do not get paid for spring training. They get meal money and nothing else. And there's some legal things that would show that it's not actually work. There is no question that minor league players do not get paid in spring training. They get meal money. They get paid very little as they are playing in the minor leagues. Why? They have no union. It's that simple. The Major League Baseball Players Union completely ignores minor league players. They focus on themselves, like any good union should. And so they ignore the minor league players. There is litigation, at least 4 cases in which minor league players are seeking to get minimum benefits under federal employment laws. Those cases are pending and unresolved. But they've done this before and have had no success. And as soon as if they find a team, you know, and they manage to push an owner into paying more, the other owners come down on him. What minor league baseball players have to be totally committed to the work. They're losing money probably over those years that they are playing minor league baseball. Okay, one more. Yeah.
Do Major League Baseball players, do they still get pensions and meal money?
The Major League Baseball players have a phenomenal pension program, unlike football players. They have huge pensions, and in spring training, depending on the individual contract, they have meal money, they have housing, they have all sorts of benefits. I mean, Major League Baseball players, I think the only reason they're going to have to try to come up with something they don't already have when they negotiate a new contract, and I can't imagine what it would be, because they have just about everything. You know, they're like a car that has all the possible alternatives, all the gadgets. They have everything already. They can only kind of level off as they go forward. And I think they're up again in 2 years. Okay, thank you very much.